And even of most universities where the seminars are in big groups, it'd be difficult to, I don't know, like get your specific thoughts and ideas, having a response to them. But Cambridge, can you explain a little bit more about what supervisions are and what supervisions look like for philosophy students?
Yeah, good. So in most supervisions, take exactly the form of like a philosophical conversation. So student will have written an essay. This is going back slightly to the difference between, I suppose, the Cambridge course and other courses. So one other difference, I think, is probably the extent to which
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We have another new guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Neil Dewar. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Philosophy and staff fellow in philosophy here at Trinity Hall.
Nice. So today we've got quite an exciting podcast upcoming for us. We're going to be talking about studying philosophy at Cambridge, going over the course structure, how Cambridge is different to other universities and what they offer for philosophy, and a bit about supervisions and interviews prep as well. Neil, for anyone who doesn't really know too much about what philosophy is or what it looks like for an undergraduate, what kind of things do philosophy students learn about in their undergraduate course?
Yeah, good. So, exactly what philosophy is and kind of what the boundaries of it are going to be is itself inevitably something that philosophers spend a lot of time worrying about. An easier question is what kinds of things does one typically cover in an undergraduate philosophy degree? And I would say there, at least in the UK and the US, there's sort of a fair degree of there's a reasonably standard kind of set of things that people would typically look at. One division that's pretty helpful, or I think often quite helpful, is sort of distinguishing between kind of theoretical philosophy. So that would be things like, so that's broadly speaking any area of philosophy that's interested in sort of what the world is like. So that's going to be, and how ought we to find out what the world is like? So that'll be metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, perhaps. Generally are taken to fall under that side. You've got practical philosophy, so philosophy of how should we live, how should we treat one another, how should we arrange our societies. So that's going to be ethics, political philosophy, maybe to some extent something like aesthetics. And then there's also history of philosophy. So sort of thinking about how people have approached these kinds of questions in the past and how does that connect up to the way we want to think about them now.
Nice. Wow. Yeah. Broad range of topics. I'm also under the influence that I've heard that philosophy at Cambridge kind of has its own history and culture and its own style in terms of the values of the course and how it leans towards certain things. Can you explain a bit more about what the philosophy course is like at Cambridge and how what kind of things students will expect to learn?
Yeah, so I think so at a broad level, I would say, I think the Cambridge course is distinctive, partly in that, we talked about this briefly before we started, that the Cambridge course falls quite heavily on what people call the analytic side of the sort of analytic continental distinction. So it's very much within that particular kind of tradition.
The analytic side.
Exactly. On the analytic side. I think perhaps the larger distinctions, I think, are so that kind of affects maybe the content and what kinds of options people have within the course. Possibly a bigger distinction, I think, is the supervision system. Partly because that the impact that has on the way the course is structured. So it means that we tend to operate with quite a stable syllabus, kind of from one year to the next. It changes. It does change, but relatively slowly, because each bit of the syllabus is being taught, in individual colleges by different people who will have kind of their own approaches. But we need to so in order to make sure that we can kind of do an exam at the end of that process in a reasonable way, then that syllabus tends to be fairly stable.
Nice.
So that's in contrast to, lots of other universities where, because you'd have kind of individual parts of the course being taught by sort of one person to a greater extent, often there'll be a bit more kind of change. It'll be a bit closer to kind of what that person, how that person kind of wants to approach it that particular year.
I see.
Whereas we get that, I suppose that kind of variation happens less at the syllabus level, but more at the level of how individual supervisors kind of approach the material. And it's partly, just a corollary, I think, of having people work through this material in supervisions.
Nice. Yeah, just to go back to the beginning of what you were saying, for anyone who doesn't know what analytic philosophy is and what continental philosophy is, can you explain like the difference between the two for us?
Good. So, in very broad terms, I should say, with regard to the split that I mentioned right at the start, I'm not a historian of philosophy. So with that caveat borne in mind, in broad terms, this is a distinction that in philosophy that emerges really in the course of the 20th century. So at least from the kind of analytic side, I think that tradition starts probably, I think generally it's thought to start with the work of Gottlob Frege in Jena, who's working as a mathematician and is one of the originators, but one of the major contributors to what we now understand as kind of modern symbolic logic. And so then Frege's work gets picked up by first Bertrand Russell and then Wittgenstein, based in Cambridge, and also figures like Frank Ramsey. And so kind of really has a very large influence on the way that philosophy is done in this country for much of the 20th century. The other kind of strand of influence is through figures like Rudolf Carnap or Hans Reichenbach, in that, so those ideas of kind of modern logic get picked up by the so-called logical empiricists in Germany and Austria, the Vienna Circle, the Berlin Circle, and kind of developed to some extent there. And then a lot of that influence then moves to the US, because many of the figures in that movement moved to the US in order to escape Nazi persecution, either kind of mostly before or to some extent during the Second World War. And so that then those ideas kind of really take root in the US. To some extent, they combine with the tradition of American pragmatism. And so you get then, ideas of analytic, or at least very closely related ideas, kind of being very, very influential in the US. And so, it ends up getting called analytic philosophy because certainly Russell and Wittgenstein and also, although a bit less, but to some extent, people like Carnap and Reichenbach would talk about things like the method of scientific analysis, or the method of scientific analysis, or the method of logical analysis, or the method of scientific analysis. And so this idea of kind of breaking down problems using sort of logical resources into their individual components.
Nice. So it sounds very logic based.
It's pretty,
And that translates. Is that a good way to describe like a proportion of the Cambridge degree, the Cambridge philosophy degree?
I think so. So, in common with many philosophy degrees, we have a mandatory logic component. So in the first year, people are required to study formal methods, which encompasses logic, elementary set theory, and probability theory. And the idea is that is a way of partly putting people in a position where they can engage with debates in philosophy of logic or philosophy of probability, but also making sure that they are, kind of able to use those tools and use those resources to think about philosophical problems using kind of those ideas as well. And that, I guess, is exactly the connection to the kind of analytic tradition.
Nice. Because I think, especially for like 16, 17-year-olds who are trying to understand what philosophy is, trying to work out what they want to study, they're probably just very unaware that different universities will have very different course structures for their philosophy course. Because someone might come across and hear phrases like philosophical literature or philosophy of religion, and just wanted to just clarify that if you're someone who really wants to get into philosophical literature or philosophy of religion, it just sounds like you wouldn't be able to do that in the philosophy course.
Yeah, so I think, so like philosophy of literature.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, exactly. So the other, so I've not kind of explained roughly, at least what analytic philosophy is. Continental philosophy, which is, there's always this slightly odd kind of, I don't know, these labels are kind of historically contingent. There's always this oddness that we have kind of one label that sounds like it's describing a methodology and the other refers to a geographical area. So Bernard Williams has this famous remark where he says, he kind of says it's very weird to have these two labels. It's as though all cars you described as either being four-wheel drive or Japanese. And like the extent to which really, to some extent, I think certainly for Williams, that's partly a skepticism about that divide. But certainly I think there is a certain methodological and subject matter kind of distinction. So, so I am very much in the kind of analytic tradition, and my sense of the continental tradition is unfortunately a bit limited.
Of course.
But it, in broad terms, again, in the 20th century, it's picking up partly different influences. So it's a lot more influenced by someone like Edmund Husserl. It's a lot more influenced by figures like Heidegger, and then develops into, picking up on Sartre and Derrida and Camus. So, that's partly, hence the label that, whereas analytic philosophy has really kind of been dominant in much of the English-speaking world, at least historically, for a lot of the 20th century, particularly France and Germany, were kind of the centers for continental philosophy.
Nice.
And it tends to make contact much more with topics in, I would say, philosophy of literature. It's probably more influential in, for example, a lot of the theory side of fields like anthropology and sociology tend to be influenced by that tradition.
Yeah, I think it's not, hopefully not too bold of me to say that. Like, it seems like with those kind of philosophical literature, the continental side is not as concerned about whether you can show like how clearly you're reasoning of the argument, whereas the analytic side, that's quite crucial.
I think that's kind of I think that's one of the methodological distinctions, is sort of how important is it to try and render ideas as clearly as possible. I'm trying not to be unfair. There's a sense in which the stereotype, at least, is that certainly the stereotype that analytic philosophers sometimes have is of continental philosophy as being kind of not concerned with clarity or rigor. I think probably is fair to say that I think continental philosophy is more forgiving of specialized terminology to some extent. I think the pushback, I take it. So I think the alternative view is that analytic philosophy thinks that everything can be rendered into straightforward, kind of plain, unpretentious language. And you might have the view that that's just not going to be possible, that some ideas are kind of too complex to admit of straightforward expression at the level of kind of clarity that analytic philosophy demands. So it ends up kind of blinding itself to that. That I think is the counter view.
So in like the Cambridge philosophy like undergraduate course, do you think someone who like goes through the course and then graduates, the skills that they would learn and experience and problem sheets as they'll go through and supervisions, would they be in a position like where they would be able to pick up these kind of like other areas of philosophy with a lot more confidence and ability, given the skills that they learn in the undergrad? Like, could you are you in a stronger position to kind of dive in, if you have a curiosity of continental philosophy, are you in a stronger position to really engage with that if you've gone through a philosophy course? And
it's a good question.
At Cambridge.
I suppose on the one hand, broadly, yes. So it'll certainly help. On the other hand, I mean, the Cambridge course has very limited opportunity for studying continental philosophy. So if that is someone's main interest, I mean, they probably would be better off doing an undergraduate degree that gives them more opportunity to study those thinkers directly. But I mean, there's a value, I think, to being, I mean, as with all things, there's a value to being conversant in both traditions, which I'm not, but.
Yeah. And so coming back to the Cambridge course, what different, could you give us a kind of picture of what typical things students will learn in their first year, and then different paths that they can go down in their second and third year?
Yeah, good. So the first year is pretty, so all parts, all the courses are compulsory in the first year. So that's metaphysics, ethics and political philosophy, third, meaning, so introductory philosophy of language. Fourth is set texts. So they look at Plato, Descartes, and Mill, introduction to the history of philosophy, effectively. And the fifth is formal methods, which I mentioned before. So you can see there, I mean, that sort of distinction that I alluded to earlier, by kind of theoretical, practical, and history of philosophy. So kind of the idea someone gets a grounding in all of those. And then but one of the things I think is relatively unusual about the Cambridge course is how quickly it opens out. So everything's compulsory in the first year. In the second year, there is one compulsory paper, which is knowledge, language, and the world. So that's a mix of epistemology, metaphysics, and some philosophy of logic and language. But that's the only compulsory course in the second year. Otherwise, people do another three optional choices, and that's from a pretty broad range. So it includes so there's ethics, there's political philosophy, there's history of analytic philosophy, kind of thing I was talking about earlier. There's the option to take a philosophy of science course. It's actually borrowed from the history and philosophy of science department. There's an option to do a jurisprudence course, which is borrowed from the law department, law faculty. So yeah, there's kind of quite a wide variety of possibilities. And then in the third year, there's no compulsory component. There, people just do four courses of their choice, again, from a very broad range. There's metaphysics, again, ethics, philosophy of mind, more philosophy of science, etc. And in the third year, there's also the option to do a dissertation, which can be on any area of philosophy that we think we could find two people to examine, basically.
Okay, nice. Damn. So just for anyone, because there's a lot of upcoming applicants and prospective students who'll be listening to this. Could you explain to the viewers what the difference is between metaphysics and epistemology?
Yeah, good. So metaphysics is broadly, what is the world like?
Okay.
I guess is the simplest kind of characterization of what metaphysics is interested in. I think and then epistemology is theory of knowledge. So it's going to be how is it that we can come to have knowledge of the world? So the challenge, particularly if you're thinking about it, the relationship between philosophy and science, is that those sound a lot like the sorts of questions scientists ask. So scientists will want to know what the world is like, and they'll equally be interested in what methods of finding out about the world are legitimate or not. And so the differences end up being, to some extent, metaphysics starts being about the kinds of questions that look like they can't be settled by scientific inquiry. So I guess an example would be, does the world possess genuine causal structure, or do things merely kind of arrange themselves in such a way that it looks like A is causing B to happen, but in fact all that's really going on is A happens, then B happens? Or do space and time exist as independent substances in their own right, or are there merely kind of spatiotemporal relationships between material bodies? So these are questions that, at least on the face of it, are about what the structure or nature of the world is,
Mm.
but it's not obvious that you could do an experiment to resolve
Yeah.
these questions one way or the other. I suppose that also illustrates that these questions, particularly from a philosophical perspective, aren't necessarily so easy to distinguish from one another. These questions about what the world is like and how could we come to know about it,
Mm.
because, for example, it seems very plausible that causal structure is important to our knowledge of the world. So it's pretty tempting to say something like, part of what it is to come to know about something involves standing in the right kind of causal relationship to it. So, and being caused by it to have certain beliefs in the right kind of way. Obviously, that story has to look very different if you don't think there's such a thing really as causation.
Yeah.
And so, particularly once you start doing, I suppose, metaphysics and thinking about these questions at this more foundational level, then it turns out that on the one hand, what you want to say about what the world is like will obviously be influenced by your views about what knowledge you can have of it. On the other hand, what kinds of knowledge we could in principle have starts to look as though it might be dependent on what sorts of structures the world offers us for getting to know about it.
Nice. And like from my like very amateur level of like philosophy, this all sounds very similar to like Immanuel Kant. Would he be the like, if someone wants to get into philosophy and get to grips with these kind of ideas, like who would you recommend that they were to either start off with or at least end off with, like who deals with these topics really well?
Yeah, you're right. So yeah, Kant is going to be a huge figure in certainly the particular kind of question I was asking there. I was thinking, I suppose insofar as I was thinking about probably the person I had in the back of my head to some extent was David Hume.
Okay.
Although there's, to some extent that is very related because Hume and Kant are very closely connected in the history of philosophy. I partly have this in mind, I suppose, because we were talking about the structure of the course. And so I said, the first of the first year courses is metaphysics.
Yeah.
Really, it's metaphysics plus some epistemology.
Okay.
And that course actually picks up on a lot of themes from Hume.
Nice.
So it's not a history of philosophy paper, but there's plenty of kind of interest from Hume's ideas. So starting with Hume is rarely a bad idea, I think, for someone interested in thinking about these questions.
Nice. Cool. I remember you also said that in the first year, I think it was said that Descartes is one of the set texts.
Yeah.
Is that his Meditations?
Exactly. Yeah. It's the Meditations.
Just as like someone who doesn't really know much about philosophy is coming, but you always hear is like, I think from my friends from different universities, Meditations by Descartes tends to be one of the first things they learn. And could you expand a bit more about that? Like why do a lot of philosophy starts off with Meditations by Descartes? Yeah,
I think because Descartes is usually characterized as the first modern philosopher.
Okay.
This is modern in the kind of early modern, this early modern sense.
Is it in the 1600s?
Mid 17th century, exactly. So not modern in the kind of normal sense of the word, but modern in the way that that lots of academic disciplines use that term.
Yeah.
So I suppose kind of post-Renaissance, kind of emergence of don't quite know. I guess the sort of transition into the Enlightenment, I think.
Yeah, but just before.
Exactly,
early modern period. It's hard to know where that phrase comes from.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't quite know why it's exactly what distinguishes it.
For the historians to answer.
Indeed, yeah. And I think, again, my historian colleagues, I'm sure, would say these judgments are always kind of retrospective. So we always look back and we read Descartes as though he's kind of the first.
Okay.
In a sequence, and we, will often kind of start with Descartes. Of course, that's not obvious from Descartes' point of view, that he's going to be the first person people read. As far as he's concerned, he's the last in a long sequence of people thinking about these questions. So I think, but to some extent, you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And Descartes, I think, stands out as somebody who is, grappling with I suppose a very distinctive set of questions and kind of doing so in a way that then gives rise to a particular kind of tradition or set of traditions of trying to answer them. So yeah, I think that's kind of why Descartes, and he provides, he also, I suppose, has this kind of dual influence where on the one hand, again, he's worrying about these epistemological questions. So how can I come to have knowledge that I'm not being deceived by a demon? But they're, for him, kind of intimately bound up with a certain kind of metaphysics, particularly famously a dualistic metaphysics consisting of mind and matter, where the extension of, the essence of matter is extension, i.e. bodily volume roughly, and the essence of mind is thought. And so you've got their kind of philosophy of mind, you've got metaphysics, you've got epistemology, you've got a certain amount of philosophy of science, because Descartes is also going to show up as, probably the most important precursor to Newton. And part of his work is, on developing a physics and developing, he lays out his 3 laws of motion. We don't think all 3 of those laws were correct, but they were, a very strong influence on Newton. And for Descartes, all of these inquiries are bound up with what we would now characterize as scientific inquiry.
Yes, it sounds like not only did a lot of philosophers after him respond to Descartes, but Descartes himself dabbled or had an interest in multiple areas of philosophy that philosophy students are going to have to engage with. He kind of does a little bit of everything.
Exactly. I think that's and I think that's what makes him so, I guess, attractive as a historical figure to introduce undergraduates to, that he's thinking about a very wide range of stuff. It's also, I suppose, it's partly as well a matter of finding work that, is different. So, there's a huge difference between the way Descartes will think about things compared to the way we will now. On the other hand, to some extent, I think, so if you take medieval philosophy to be kind of pre-Cartesian philosophy, that in many ways is harder to engage with, because it does rapidly start to get to, a very different, kind of thought world, if you like. Which isn't to say, to be clear, it's certainly worth engaging with. And indeed, one of the third-year papers is History of Philosophy in the Long Middle Ages, where students have the opportunity to engage with kind of medieval thinkers.
Is it the methodology that's mainly different?
Yeah, I think it's, I suppose, part is background presumptions. So, one obvious difference between any philosophy up until relatively recently and more contemporary thought, I suppose, is the role of religion. So the extent to which the existence of God is assumed, and part of it's a very strong constraint on inquiry that you're able to, as it were, render it consistent with what you take your theology to be. And that's a very, very important constraint on philosophy historically. That is, it's true for philosophers who are religious, or philosophers who do have kind of strong theological views. But I would say, as religion is much less common, so it's no longer as strong a methodological constraint.
Especially post-Enlightenment and and contemporary times like now. I think also, so something that you said right at the beginning, that's quite special about the Cambridge course, is that I think a lot of people kind of get into philosophy by normally by primarily reading books, but it'd be so much better if you guys were able to get a kind of like a conversation or response from books, which you obviously can't with books. And even with most universities where the seminars are in big groups, it's it'd be difficult to, get your specific thoughts and ideas, having a response to them. But Cambridge, can you explain a little bit more about what supervisions are and what supervisions look like for philosophy students?
Yeah, good. So in most supervisions, take exactly the form of like a philosophical conversation. So student will have written an essay. This is, going back slightly to the difference between, I suppose, the Cambridge course and other courses. So one other difference, I think, is probably the extent to which kind of self-directed study, albeit steered by your supervisions, is sort of the center of the way people learn philosophy here. I mean, there's a syllabus, there are reading lists, but the expectation is that you are kind of actively and independently engaging with that material, and then you're getting guidance from your supervisions. It's the sort of primary mode of learning, and then there are lectures that give helpful overviews, but those are intended in some sense as kind of supplementary rather than really core. And then and one of the good things about that, I think, is that it does give people an opportunity to engage with this material in a way that is partly that they can kind of choose their own path through it to some extent, because any of these ideas are so large and so rich that I don't think any two people are going to end up with the same kind of understanding of what's going on in a particular area. So it gives you the opportunity to develop your understanding of what you ought to think about Descartes or Hume or Kant or whatever. But then the other factor that I think is really significant is that philosophy does feel much more natural as a dialogue. So as kind of working through an idea together rather than, I mean, to some extent, I think it's not, again, there's lots of debates about what philosophy consists in. It's, at least to my mind, seems very plausible that it's a mistake to sort of think of it as a body of knowledge that can simply be passed on from one person to another. I think it's much more like an activity. And I think giving students the opportunity to like practice that activity with their supervisor, I think is one of the really, really valuable things about the way we teach it.
Nice, because if it was a body of knowledge that suggests that two supervisions of two different students, where it was on the same essay question, would be identical supervisions. But I imagine that the supervisions can be very different, even if you're going through the same essay question.
Indeed, yeah, exactly. Because I mean, I will often sort of end up kind of doing my supervisions in such a way that I'll have, the same, so two students who are both doing the same course kind of at around the same time. So maybe like 2 to 3 p.m. I've got student 1, 3 to 4 p.m. student 2. And as you say, exactly like same essay question, but then these two students may well have answered the question in very different ways, and their essays might have gone in very different directions. And even if hypothetically, I think two people had turned up with very similar essays, the conversation will naturally kind of go in very different directions as you try out ideas, test one sort of option for thinking about what's going on, I don't know, maybe realize some problems, discard it, move on to the next, and so on and so forth.
Which says a lot about how personalized the teaching here is at Cambridge.
It is,
it's very hard to do that if that was a big group. I imagine from the I think it's probably like this is the case with like any problem solving subject. For the student, it must save so much time if they're trying to work out like a few like issues of the course that they just can't get their head around. And what could have been hours of reading could be just solved by like 30 seconds of like time with an expert in the field.
I think so, yeah. So I like to start the supervisions. I mean, there's a lot of variation in how people do supervisions. I generally like to start with, some questions like, okay, so what are the things that, either points that you thought were particularly interesting that you want to, make sure we have an opportunity to talk about, or things that you were kind of confused about that, don't make sense to you and that you would like to try and resolve the puzzlement. I mean, the only thing I'd say is that, I think partly what you often establish by like asking an expert is that the reason why you're confused about this is because there's no single answer. But that's also, you will often, I think, if anything, probably my experience of teaching philosophy most often involves people kind of asking a question to which the answer is, you're going to have to make up your own mind. Here are some candidate answers. Here are some things that people think, but there's not this single univocal kind of right answer. But even that, I think, can be very helpful to know that, the reason why it wasn't clear to you whether all X's are Y or whatever is because actually, no one really can agree.
Nice. Do you have like a favorite topic that you like doing supervisions on?
It's a good question. I do always really enjoy. So my research is primarily in philosophy of physics and philosophy of logic. So I always really enjoy doing supervisions in those areas.
Nice.
Though, I think one of the things that I suppose I like from the perspective of the supervisor is that it generally, I supervise across a reasonably wide range of areas. And it's often the case that, areas that I maybe haven't thought about that much recently. In some cases, maybe I haven't really thought about it since I was a graduate student. And so sitting down, with somebody who's kind of working through these problems for the first time is like a really fun, interesting experience for me as well.
Because you both do it kind of to work that.
Exactly.
Nice. That's really cool. And what does the ratios tend to be between supervisor to student? Are these 1 to 2 supervisions, 1 to 1?
So in philosophy, I think it's mostly 1 to 1.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow. I think more so than other subjects. I think we tend to teach students as individuals. Partly.
That's really good.
Yeah. No,
because it's a lot. I think a lot of courses are not at least like 1 to 2, maybe 1 to 1. But it's pretty cool that philosophy specifically, because 1 to 1, as we said before, like it means that the student gets so much attention to the things that they're struggling with.
I think that's it. Yeah, it's sort of quite a lot harder, I find, to have really kind of focused conversation if there's because 2 people already will be thinking about things in quite different ways. So already me and the student are probably thinking about things in different ways, and then having a third person, it kind of varies a bit. In the first, so we teach, the way we do it here in Trinity Hall, the first year supervisions in the first term are done in groups of 2 or 3, depending on how many people are in the year. Partly, I think, so that people just arrived. There's
1 to 1 could be quite intense.
It can be a little bit, exactly. But then, so they get a term to kind of get used to it, and then by the second term we start doing one-on-one, and then it kind of varies. I have done 2-on-1 for second years, and sometimes, and by the time people are in third year, I find generally, I think that is most commonly one-to-one teaching. That said, there's an exception. Next term I'm going to be teaching mathematical logic. Those supervisions I'm planning on doing in a group of 4, but for 2 hours rather than 1.
Okay.
So
I see,
but because it's a somewhat more mathematical subject, it seemed to me that that might be an area where there was a value to kind of having more time, but doing a larger group.
That's quite interesting. So I'm just thinking about those who are listening who are really interested in maths, but maybe very much towards the pure maths, and you're just talking about mathematical logic. Could you explain a bit for us, like what mathematical logic is and what it entails?
In general, I suppose logic is the study of argument, the study of reasoning.
Okay.
What is it that makes an argument valid? Classic example is something like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So you kind of start with those sorts of patterns of reasoning. And so the first question is, okay, let's see if we can understand, provide a kind of formal mathematical model of this sort of area of language. And that's roughly what people do in the first year. So in the formal methods course, they kind of learn the resources they need to do that. That then naturally kind of leads into, on the one hand, lots of sort of philosophical questions, like, what's the nature of logical form? If we think 2 arguments are the same logical form, what does that mean? What's the nature of truth? Because lots of these analyses are going to invoke the idea of truth. so quite a few of those questions get done in the knowledge, language, and the world paper. There's also, quite a bit of questions in philosophy of logic and philosophy of logic come up under the history of analytic paper in the second year. So that's also what people will often take if they're really interested in those kinds of questions. And then, the mathematical logic paper in the third year is really starting to, it's kind of looking at more advanced logic. So on the one hand, starting to look more seriously at set theory, which, is kind of connected to logic insofar as, well, on the one hand, set theory is providing the kind of background for the kind of semantics that we use in logic. So it's providing the mathematical resources that are used. On the other hand, certain kinds of logic, so particularly second order logic, are very closely related to set theory. And then the other element that the mathematical logic course discusses in some detail is topics like Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So developing proof systems for arithmetic, showing that, and kind of really diving into the foundations of mathematics elements of logic, and showing that there can be no complete, consistent, and recursively axiomatizable proof system. So that's really, I think, as with many courses, the kind of crowning jewel of the mathematical logic course to some extent is probably the Gödel incompleteness theorems.
So it sounds like, if someone wants to because you get 5 university options, so you can choose 5 universities, and for a few of them they're choosing maths and philosophy, and that's the kind of thing they want to do. Can you do kind of maths and philosophy within the philosophy course? Because I think the title philosophy, it might not be intuitive that there's actually a lot of
mathematical components.
Yeah, exactly.
So it wouldn't be possible, I think, to do so compared to a sort of mathematics and philosophy course. So I know Oxford has a joint honours in mathematics and philosophy, for example. It's probably not possible to construct a version of the philosophy degree that is as mathematically focused as that is, maybe unsurprisingly. But certainly, again, because the course is quite open and quite flexible, the first year, you're going to be reading Descartes and Mill, for example, and doing ethics and political philosophy. So the first year, there's no, it's all compulsory. But then, somebody who did in the second year, knowledge, language, of the world, which is compulsory, history of analytic philosophy, maybe like a philosophy of science paper, and let's say the natural final option would probably be something like, I don't actually know what would be a natural kind of fourth option. Possibly, slightly less clear what their fourth paper should be in the second year, I guess, if you're primarily interested in, but and most people will have some interest in doing ethics or early modern philosophy, or Greek and Roman philosophy or something. And then in the third year, there would be the option to do mathematical logic, philosophical logic, say metaphysics, and philosophy of science. And that adds up to a pretty kind of logic heavy sort of orientation. So I suppose that, so it would be kind of increasingly specialized in mathematics, in the kind of mathematical side of philosophy.
Nice. So we get a lot of questions from students who are thinking about studying philosophy at Cambridge, and they're wanting to know what kind, what we would recommend for super-curricular activities, or what kinds of philosophy they should get into, because it seems like there's such a huge range. I think students are struggling to know where to start, and they don't want to start with something that's too difficult, but they also want to read stuff that's that will help them with their Cambridge course.
Yeah, good. So I think there's there's a few classic introductions. I think the philosophy website, I think, has prospective or suggested reading for prospective students.
Nice.
So I'd encourage looking at that. That'll be a much more comprehensive list than anything I can say now. But there's a few really nice. I mean, so one classic is Think by Simon Blackburn.
Okay.
Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. So there's a few, those are both kind of nice introductions to sort of philosophical questions. Then, I mean, there's some good podcasts. So The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps as a very nice, overview of the history of philosophy. Otherwise, I mean, the other thing I think I'd say is maybe that I think a lot of what helps is a kind of just a general curiosity. So I think it's, I think I'd encourage people to not just be reading philosophy, but be reading, other texts, in whatever kind of field you think is interesting. So you could be reading about politics, you could be reading about economics, you could be reading about science, you could be reading about mathematics, you could be reading about, management principles for large organizations. Like all of these things in principle, I think can give rise to philosophically interesting questions.
Yeah.
And I think it can be helpful sometimes for people to, be kind of giving themselves grist to work with as well.
So because I guess it's not just about consuming more knowledge, but also trying to develop that skill of like curiosity, inquiry, being observing, and questioning, which I guess one can develop like quite strongly without having to do a lot of reading.
And I mean, there's also because I mean, particularly in terms of activities as well. I mean, things like debating or Model United Nations, I think, are things that a lot of students find valuable as an opportunity to, kind of practice those skills of arguing and working through ideas that are going to be really important.
Well, it's like trying to like define like philosophical terms, like in itself could that be like a super-curricular activity, like so trying like a student trying to work out for themselves what like a definition for like, I don't know, ethics, or what does a color mean, things like that. Would those kind of explorations then help with philosophy undergraduate course at Cambridge?
I think that's right. There's a sense in which, I don't know, somebody who to some extent it's probably better. So compared to having, say, I don't know, read your way through the whole of some dialogue by Plato, it's almost probably better to have only read like a quarter of it, because you stopped every page to try and puzzle through the questions being asked for yourself.
Nice.
I suspect the latter would be more productive than the former.
And is that a thing that like philosophy students find, or students or researchers, where they've read books and realize that they've done this thinking at a previous time in their life, and they just happen to read that piece of work after they've worked that out? Does that make sense?
I think it does happen to some extent. I mean, so there's certainly, so I think for lots of students, I think that's what a lot of students like about philosophy is, coming across it and realizing that this is a place where this turns out to be the name for all the kinds of questions that they had been really wanting to ask. And sometimes I think it can be quite a while before students sort of encounter philosophy and being like, oh, that's what I've been. It turns out this is what I've been interested in my whole life.
Nice.
I think that sense of recognition happens a lot. And I think, you're right that, I mean, certainly within, I mean, even as a philosophy academic, I find, I don't know, it's sort of inspiring and slightly unnerving how big a role serendipity seems to play in my own work. So I've lost track, I think, of the number of times that I've been, stuck on some particular problem and like trying to kind of work my way through it, trying to really understand it. I've been sort of beavering away at it, without necessarily really making much progress. And then I go to, I go to a talk that I wasn't planning on going to, but I'm only going because a friend of mine has told me that they think it'll be good or something. And it turns out that this talk in political theory has exactly the concept that I need to kind of unlock the thing I'm trying to figure out in philosophy of science and to press things forward, or in a completely unrelated area. So that I read something in, again, kind of like what I was saying earlier, that I read a book that's in mathematics or sociology or history, and again suddenly find lurking there kind of exactly the insight I was looking for, and to deal with exactly the kind of problem that I was dealing with.
Nice. And that I guess that brings back to that skill of kind of being observant and like having an open mind, which I think isn't talked as much about compared to this kind of pressure of having to read everything. And they're like two very different skill sets.
I think that's it. I mean, it's the fact that philosophy does sort of connect to so many other different areas. And I mean, there's so much philosophy that's been written, and then particularly if you take an expansive definition of what's relevant to philosophy, it rapidly becomes totally impossible for any one person to have read anything approaching all of it. I think that can be very unnerving for people to feel. I mean, this is something certainly people find. The fact that the reading lists are typically longer than they can, they're not going to be able to get through everything on the reading list. I think sometimes, particularly at school, you're kind of encouraged to take this quite kind of completionist attitude towards study, where it's about, you're finished with the revision when you've kind of read all the things that are relevant. I think one of the things that is in some ways difficult about transitioning to studying a subject at university is recognizing that these are open-ended things. Even the stuff we put on the reading list is not the end of the story. And so this is not about mastering a kind of fixed body of things. It's about finding and engaging with the material that you find helpful. And there's a sense in which that's very liberating. It's no longer required that you have to read and engage with something just because somebody in an office somewhere has decided that you're supposed to know about it. If you read it and you don't think it's interesting, you don't think it's helpful, then you can kind of ignore it. You should have a reason for ignoring it. You should be able to say, certainly when it comes to exams and things, particularly if it's something very central, you probably need a reason for saying, actually, I don't think this is as insightful as everyone thinks it is. But you're perfectly at liberty to do that.
Nice. Just now that you've mentioned, it's quite interesting. Like, how are Cambridge students expected to approach their philosophy reading lists?
Right. So we do single out some things as the reading lists there'll always be some things picked out as particularly central, and so those are recommended at least as starting points, and then it really is. I think a question of recognizing that the reading list is there to steer people, but it's not necessarily the last word. And so although that said, I think for most people the issue is not, how do I go beyond the stuff that's on the reading list? It's how do I decide which of the things on the reading list I ought to be looking at. And I think it is a matter of people, I suppose almost what I want is for students to, as they progress through the degree, I think students increasingly learn to kind of trust their own instincts and develop the confidence to, based on to sort of, read a description of a text, one text in another, and say, oh, that sounds really interesting. And, I'm going to go off and explore that idea and dive more deeply into it. Or, as often happens, to start reading something else and go, okay, this is just horribly confused. I think this person, I don't think I'm going to get anything insightful from this. I'm going to stop reading it, or I'm going to skim the rest of it, look for anything that's I think is worth taking away, and otherwise just put it on the pile along with the other things that don't work for me.
So cultivating a skill of decision making, whether it's
exactly
the reading through a contents page or an introduction and deciding, the way this is written or the things that they're talking about, I'm going to get a lot from this.
Right.
or something else that they think this is something to come back later to, because it's clearly presupposing that a lot of other knowledge that they need to
Exactly, yeah. Because I mean, that's one of the key skills that we want people to walk away with. So, I mean, anyone who's going into a research career, obviously this is vital, because in the course of, well, research in philosophy, or for that matter in any other field, you need to be able to, as it were, take this big literature and find the stuff that is valuable, that is helpful. But also, I mean, basically, I think particularly, I suppose, in the modern world, the basic problem most people are confronted with is not that they have to find the information they need. It's that all the information is there, it's being kind of thrown at them, and they've got to find how to navigate it.
And work out what things they should give their attention to.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Another thing, quite a sharp pivot that students really want to know a lot about is, and quite topical for the time that we're in now, is the Cambridge interviews for each of the subjects. They're quite curious about what the interviews are like, what they should expect, how they should prepare for them. And I was wondering, want to hear from you, what interviews look like for philosophy applicants.
Yeah, so I mean, it varies a bit from one college to another.
Okay.
I think things that I suppose are fairly distinctive about philosophy interviews generally. One is that we aren't testing for knowledge in the way that lots of other subjects will be.
Interesting.
So, I mean, I think almost no subject thinks of the interview merely as an opportunity to test somebody's subject matter expertise knowledge, but we're perhaps unusual in that, I mean, the philosophy A level is not a required, it's not a prerequisite of applying, nor is it a prerequisite of doing the course. So we are not basically testing to see whether you can recognize, I think people sometimes think that we're going to be kind of presenting them with an argument that's Descartes, and they've got to identify that it's Descartes. And I mean, it's nice if somebody does that and says, "Oh, this seems parallel to a thing that Descartes said." Like that, that's nice, but it's certainly not a prerequisite. I mean, I didn't do philosophy at school, for example, and so I think we're more interested in partly kind of seeing somebody's capacity to reason analytically and reason logically, and we will often ask at least some questions that are designed to explicitly test that aspect. I mean, that's often the questions that I end up asking in our interviews. And so that's, kind of making sure that somebody is going to be at ease working through the kind of more formal kind of logic focused parts of the course. And then more generally, I suppose we'll want to engage them on some sort of questions or topics of philosophical interest, but really we're interested in, to what extent how does somebody get on with working through and elaborating their ideas, particularly in a kind of verbal discussion-based sort of, dialogue. So there's a sense in which, I mean, I think, what is a philosophy interview like? I think, as with many subjects, the answer to some extent is it's a lot like a supervision. And it's about, kind of, to some extent, seeing how well somebody gets on in that kind of environment.
That's interesting. So I'll be right in saying that a student who, like, there's like very little culture capital for whatever reason, no classic or academic philosophy authors or texts that they've read, but they have very good reasoning skills and philosophical reasoning, and they engage with the questions well. Questions that that themselves don't require any prerequisite knowledge. That could lead to a very successful interview.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Wow. That is. Yeah, I think that is quite different to most of the other subjects. Well, I mean, all of the subjects, they are normally that's what's normally said is that it's going to be based on A-level content and nothing beyond A-level. But it sounds like, but with philosophy, there's no prerequisite to be aware of the philosophy A-level either.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't go beyond A level.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
true. But yeah, exactly. That we, I mean, so again, I suppose, and it partly comes back, I suppose, to this idea that, we're interested in it as, it partly comes back to this idea of philosophy almost as a practice or activity rather than a fixed body of truths. So, we're sort of, to some extent, the interview is an opportunity, give somebody an opportunity to engage in that activity and, engage in that activity with us and see if it seems like they'd find it fruitful to be doing that for 3 years.
Yeah. So the course is entirely trying to work out who will enjoy doing this activity, which will then lead on to lots of reading, lots of essay writing, but is all built on like consistent philosophical inquiry.
Exactly, yeah, and that spirit of curiosity.
Yeah. Nice, that's really cool. It's like the subject of curiosity out of all of the
Maybe. Yeah, we'd certainly like to claim so. But.
Nice. And lastly, just wanted to hear more about your favorite interests of philosophy and what kind of research you do, because so I think I remember we were talking before, you've gone through quite a journey where you've been in different places with regards to research in Munich as well.
So my journey is, sorry, I don't know why that came out so sarcastic. But yeah, so my journey through has been, I studied at Oxford. So I did physics and philosophy as a joint degree, and then stayed for postgrad in Oxford. Had a year in the US still as a graduate student at Princeton, and then my first job after the PhD was in Munich. So I was there for 5 years at LMU Munich, and then came to Cambridge in 2021.
Nice.
So yeah, fairly reasonably international. But my research interests are primarily philosophy of physics, and also philosophy of logic. With then also interests in metaphysics, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of language, and so on.
So what kind of stuff does like philosophy and physics entail? Is that looking at the philosophy of like quantum mechanics, or is this like Big Bang stuff or general relativity?
So maybe there's two. All of those basically. Okay. So so philosophy of quantum mechanics is a major area. Philosophy of general relativity, or more generally, kind of philosophy of space and time. It's big. A lot of interesting work on philosophy of statistical mechanics, and kind of thermal physics. There's kind of increasing interest in topics like philosophy of cosmology. That poses kind of its own, quite distinctive, sort of interesting philosophical questions. I would say, my research interests are mostly in kind of foundations of space-time theories to some extent. So I spent some time thinking about like general relativity and related theories. And then my graduate work was mostly on the interpretation of symmetries in physical theories, and kind of particularly their sort of interpretational significance. So their significance for how we distinguish between the physical content of a theory and the bits of a theory that are kind of there for mathematical convenience, but don't we think correlate to anything in the physical world.
So then completely abstract.
It gets very, exactly. Those bits of the theory that are very abstract. Exactly. Yeah. So the classic example is something like a coordinate system where one of the points in your space gets labeled 0, 0, 0, but there's nothing physical, or in general there need not be anything physically significant about that point. It's just it's where you kind of choose to put your origin in trying to describe the space mathematically.
Yeah, which is either quite ironic or unironic.
Right. Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. Exactly. Slightly more generally, I think I'm interested in how it is that physical theories represent. So physical theories being these kind of mathematical structures, we take them to be depicting the world in a certain sense. And I'm sort of interested in, how it is that they do that, what the constraints are on when they can do that successfully, how we distinguish between, as it were, when a theory or a part of a theory is really saying something about the world compared to when it's just a kind of artifact of the representation, and those sorts of questions.
So would I be right in saying, like, in kind of layman's terms, for my sake, trying to work out where the boundary is of articulating what we can describe of the world, like, and trying to see like how where the edge is. Does that?
Yeah, I think that's nice. Exactly. Like,
because there are things that we kind of agree that we don't have access to, and things that we do. It sounds like you're trying to work out how much of can we explain of.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think sort of the nature and limits of representation is a fair characterization of the. And I mean that in general is a very kind of well-worn philosophical topic.
Okay.
And then I suppose I'm interested in specifically in the context of physics.
Okay.
Partly because I guess if you narrow the focus a bit, and it feels like maybe it's possible to make progress, whereas perhaps
through the physics side.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of makes the question feel, at least to me, a little bit more tractable.
Yeah. Then like wishy-washy. It's a bit of a blunt way of saying it.
Yeah, I don't even necessarily mean. I mean, well, one advantage is that it gives you a very precise kind of set of mathematical tools to kind of apply to the problem. So in that sense, but I mean, all of these are reasons why it seems to me like dealing with this question in the context of physics is a little bit, I mean, ironically, a little bit easier, perhaps. I think, there are people who engage with these questions in the context of linguistic representation or mental representation. And I mean, that seems much harder than the kind of thing I do, because I think the sorts of representational tools available in those contexts are so much more varied and so much broader that, it's kind of above my pay grade.
Nice. That's really cool. I mean, I think it's sort of, throughout this whole discussion, we've showed a huge range of places where philosophy students can go post course, what they can study during the course, and different examples of how they can get into philosophy. So thanks, Neil. I think that's everything that we have time for today.
Great, thank you very much.
And thanks for the viewers for listening in, whether that's through YouTube or your podcasting platform. We'll be having more podcasts with different subjects and different academics across the university. So stay tuned, and we'll see you guys next time.
Cool.
Nice.
Thank you.
Cool.